So this week we're talking about the economy and politics, and specifically you're going to be watching some films that talk about the intersection of these two entities. But before we get started, I want to go through a few definitions and apply some sociological theory. The economy is the area within society that determines how it produces, distributes, and consumes goods and services. So within the film Panic, we were specifically taking a look at this process as it relates to housing in the United States. Politics, on the other hand, are defined as those individuals and groups that acquire and exercise power and authority and make decisions. It's important to recognize that political systems as well as economic ones differ from country to country, and those differences tend to focus around factors such as globalization and technology. Before we move on to the next section of our lecture, we need to take a moment and review the sociological perspectives as it relates to the economy. When we're looking at functionalism typically emphasizes the benefits of work in the economy. Functionalists will also see capitalism as bringing prosperity to society as a whole. Now, critics will point out that work is a significant source of stress, and U.S. corporations are not interested in their workers' well-being. In the private sector, 30% of full-timers and 74% of part-timers don't have paid sick days. Even when business improves, many employers will convert full-time jobs to part-time or temporary positions and cut health benefits. According to conflict theory, capitalism creates social problems. Globalization has led to job insecurity and a handful of transnational conglomerates have enormous power. We'll define transnational conglomerates in the next section. For conflict theorists, low wages alienate employees rather than motivate them to work harder. They also argue that capitalism enables the rich and powerful to exploit other groups, resulting in huge disparities. A critical evaluation of this theory faults the theory for emphasizing economic constraints rather than choices and underestimating people's ability to get ahead. In feminist theory, the scholars here agree with conflict theorists that there's widespread workplace inequality, but as you might suspect, they're going to emphasize gender as a critical factor. Across all levels and occupations, women, especially Latinas and Black women, earn less than men. Both historically and currently, women have lower earnings than men because of occupational sex segregation, which we've talked about recently, as well as glass ceilings and glass escalators. Women make up less than half of the labor force, but hold more than 2/3 of all the low-wage jobs. Many women's earnings suffer from that motherhood penalty that we talked about when we reviewed gender and sexuality. Critics of feminist theory here note that men don't always dominate women in the workplace and that there's considerable gender inequality in socialist, communist, and mixed economies, not just capitalist ones. And they question whether the economy reinforces sex discrimination or simply reflects cultural sexism. The last theory we'll look at is symbolic interactionism. Symbolic interactionists are especially interested in how work shapes people's self-identity. Remember, this is a micro-analysis perspective. Interactionists also study how people are socialized into their jobs and the informal rules that shape behavior. We talked about all of this when we talked about groups and leadership styles. Critics of this particular theory include that symbolic interactionism provides in-depth analysis but lacks scope, as findings in small groups may not be applicable to large groups or companies. Another limitation is that interactionism, of course, does not take a look at macro-level social forces. There are 4 different types of economic systems, so let's go through each one of those. Capitalism is the first economic system we'll look at. In capitalism, the dreaded socialism. This is the next economic system we'll talk about. Socialism is based on the public ownership of the production of goods and services. So ideally, within this particular system, there's a collective ownership of property. Here, everyone's going to work together instead of competing against one another. And while we're working together, we're working for the greater good. Within socialism, there is no profit motive. Competition and individual profits are actually officially forbidden, although we will often see that certain groups are in a position to enjoy, quote unquote, more than the larger society. The primary difference between socialism and communism is that socialism allows for some free market. This isn't the case with communism. This political and economic system is one where property is communally owned and all people are considered equal. That is, people receive resources based on their need, and there's no motivation for working hard. Historians have said that communism has failed for multiple reasons, but some of these reasons include things like widespread corruption, oppression, and just the overall economic inefficiency that's resulted in shortages of foods and goods within the society. The last economic system that we'll talk about is called a mixed economy. This is what we see here in the United States, and there's a few different forms of this. The first is called welfare capitalism. Welfare capitalism is what you get when there's a combination of private ownership of property, market competition, and government regulation of programs and services. The second type is called crony capitalism. Crony capitalism is based on those close relationships between the business and political classes. This is what we see when the cumulative resources are amassed between the two. So think about a few weeks back when I talked about those folks who work in the higher levels of administration in government, military, and business. They retire from one sector and they move to another, and they take all of those resources with them and are in a position to capitalize on them. This is a form of crony capitalism. Within this particular economic system, the government will provide tax breaks, subsidies, and grants to wealthy people and large corporations, often at the cost of those in the lower socioeconomic status arenas. It's important to note here that large companies drive both capitalism and mixed economies. Again, we saw this play out in the film Panic. Corporations in particular wield enormous amounts of influence both in their home country as well as in those countries where they have additional sites set up. Let's take a few minutes to talk about corporations. Corporations are those organizations that have legal rights, privileges, and liabilities apart from those of its employees and administration. In the U.S., there are almost 6 million corporations that exist, but just 0.5% make 90% of all of the corporate income that's generated. So how does that happen? Well, most of the time, this happens because the corporation is actually a conglomerate. A conglomerate is a corporation that owns a collection of companies in different industries. So think Colony Brands. Colony Brands, most of you may know, is a small cheese company, also known as Swiss Colony Brand, in Monroe, Wisconsin. But in reality, through a series of acquisitions and mergers, Colony Brands now also owns Montgomery Ward, 7th Avenue, and Home Goods. They diversified their business risk by participating in different markets, thereby increasing their sustainability and longevity. I think oftentimes students get this idea of a conglomerate confused with what is actually known as a transnational corporation. A conglomerate is not necessarily a corporation that operates overseas. A transnational corporation, however, is. A transnational corporation is a large company based in one country that operates across international boundaries. So think, for example, McDonald's. Now, there is such thing as a transnational conglomerate, and that owns a collection of different companies in various industries in a number of countries. So here, think GE. General Electric is the biggest transnational conglomerate. getting close to a monopoly, so close in fact are they to being, quote, too big to fail, that just 8 years ago they were forced to sell off the railroad division, or at least large chunks of it, because of their size. The last concept I want to talk about as it relates to corporations is that of interelecting directorates. An interelecting directorate is what happens when the same people serve on the boards of several companies or corporations across industry and across sectors. What tends to happen is these individuals then develop a similar economic perspective. You guys remember the concept of groupthink? Because that's what we're talking about here. It's seen at every level of politics, economics, and the government. With interelecting directorates, approximately 15 to 20% of the participants sit on 2 or more boards and are more likely to be put on a government advisory board. Some of these directorates are especially powerful because they include people like past U.S. presidents, members of Congress, who provide quite strong connections to Washington, D.C. Once they are able to sit on these boards, they're now in a position to impact both the economy and the national agenda. In the last section of this lecture, we're going to take a look at the various forms of government and the sociological perspectives associated therein. So let's start with what is government. Generally speaking, government is defined as a formal organization that has the authority to make and enforce laws within a society. There are certain universals, regardless of the type of government that exists within a culture, that are associated with governments. So governments are expected to maintain order, provide social services, regulate the economy, establish educational systems, create armed forces for defense, and ensure their residents' safety. Political systems vary in their type, as well as the political freedom associated with that type. In a democracy, citizens control the state and its actions. Principles within a democracy include individuals are able to participate in decisions and select responsive leaders. The right to vote is open to everyone with free, fair, frequent, and secret elections. The government recognizes individual rights, and the rule of law requires everyone to obey the law and be accountable for any violations of the law. If democracy is on one end of a scale for political systems, totalitarianism is on the other end. In a totalitarian government, the government controls every aspect of a person's life. Secret police are present, and the military intimidate people into conformity. Somewhere in the middle of this continuum would be authoritarianism. An authoritarian government is one where the state controls the lives of its citizens, but permits some degree of individual freedom. A monarchy is completely different. A monarchy is what happens when power is based on heredity. The power is legitimized by both tradition and religion. In the interest of time, I'm not going to go through this particular chart, but you can read through the information associated with it in your textbook or download the PowerPoint that's in Moodle to take a look at the speaker notes for this slide. Okay, that wraps up the abbreviated lecture for this week. Make sure you watch the remaining videos before you complete the assignment that's going to be due on Sunday by 11:59 p.m. You guys have a great weekend, and I'll see you next week.